Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more of the Massacre at Mozote. Yes, I am already behind with the episode, but we are going to do this anyway. Because, we need to. But, let's go ahead and jump right into this. I sat there shivering for what felt like ages, she says. Finally, pushing through the underbrush, came maybe 8 or 10 compass. That's what we're looking at. I started babbling, and they told me to shut up. They had already walked in Susan and Ray, and the thought of walking up in another of these reporters who couldn't carry equipment didn't please them. They bitched and moaned about it. They loaded up and just started walking. It was pitch black. My heart was thumping so loudly I couldn't hear. By the time we got to the river, the moon had come up and you could see everything. They recorded the river, left me standing there. Finally, one of them came up and real embarrassed, and said, "You have to take your pants off." They were peasants, Puritans, bikini bottom. I forded Puritan. So there I was on the riverbank in the full moonlight in this tiny bikini bottom. I forded it by myself and almost drowned. My camera was ruined. My pack was all wet. Someone came over, threw a few cold tortillas at me, and we started walking again. I was wet, miserable, lonely, and terrified. Bonner and Masilas and Guillermo Prieto described the trip the same way, hiking all night through the moonlit mountains, and at dawn coming upon the first guerrilla camp, a scattering of tents under pine trees that had 25 or 30 people. The guerrillas were very short-tempered, irritable, says Guillermo Prieto. They were under great stress. The guides would not say where they were or where precisely they were going. The guerrillas were very, very spooked about the whole security situation, and they didn't want to tell us much, she said. It was a military secret where we were. They didn't want us to tell they didn't want to tell us any specifics. By dawn of the third day, January the 6th, Bonner and Massacre had reached the area of El Mozote. There were bodies and parts of bodies, Massacre said. We saw about 25 houses destroyed around Arambala and Mozote. My strongest memory was this grouping of evangelicals, 14 of them, who had come together thinking their faith would protect them. They were strewn across the earth next to the cornfield, and you could see on their faces the horror of what had happened to them. Bonner and Massacre spent a couple of hours walking around the outskirts of Mozote and the neighboring hamlet of Tierra Colorada. The tour appears to have been somewhat haphazard. They were never shown the center of El Mozote, apparently, or the sacristy. Massacre shot 2 rolls of film. By this time in El Salvador, I'd seen a lot, she says. I'd had to image a lot of death, bodies upon bodies. If I'd thought I was there to prove that a massacre had happened, I would have imaged many more bodies. At a burial near El Zapatal, they were introduced to Rufina Amaya, and Bonner interviewed her at length. A few days later, the guerrillas handed him a list of names. I was sitting on this low brick wall watching these guerrilla recruits training, Bonner said. They were marching back and forth, both with sticks. They didn't know what the hell they were doing, and these guys came up to me with this list, handwritten, several pages. It contained, they said, the names of those who had died at El Mozote and the surrounding hamlets. I did the tally, Bonner said, came up with the number 700, tried to get the number of men, women, and children, got a sample of names. A few days later, after watching the guerrillas retake Hokoatik from the army, Bonner and Masalas began the hike back to Honduras. At the middle camp, they met a battered Guillermo Prieto, one of whose legs was swollen from an accident involving a rock and a mule. At just about the time Bonner reached Mexico City and began to file his stories, Guillermo Prieto was nearing El Mozote. We started smelling it from Armbala, she said. These kids started leading me down paths and pointing to houses and saying again and again, "Aquí hay muertos! Aquí hay muertos!" The most traumatizing thing was looking at these little houses where whole families had been blown away. These recognizable human beings in their little dresses just lying there, mummifying in the sun. We kept walking, got to El Mozote. We walked down these charming and beautiful roads, then to the center of town, where there was this kind of rubbly place, the sacristy, and in it the stupefying number of bones. There was a charred wooden beam lying on top of the bodies, and there were bones sticking up and pieces of flesh. You could see vertebrae and femurs sticking out. No attempt had been made to bury the bodies. In some shock, she was led to La Guacamaya. Everyone there had lost someone in his family. Everyone. And everyone was in a state of controlled hysteria. I mean, at that time, survival was in question. There was a real problem of how to eat, how to find enough food and stay alive. The great exodus that had begun with the offensive in mid-December was still underway. It was that massacre, the most horrible, that really caused the glass of water to overflow. Licho told me. People flowed out of the zone either toward Honduras or south toward Gotera or into the guerrillas. A lot of people joined us as combatants then. We controlled the zone, but there were no people left there. It had been Monterosa's strategy to deprive the fish of its water, and it had apparently succeeded. At the urging of Jonas, the guerrilla commander, Guillermo Prieto saw Rufina the next day. Later, she spoke to two young men who had seen their families murdered in La Jolla. Then, thinking of Bonner and his head start, she scribbled her story in her notebook, folded up the pages, and hid them in a plastic film canister. She found the guerrilla courier and persuaded him with some difficulty to carry the precious cargo to Tegucigalpa and deliver it to a colleague who could telephone the story to the post. On January the 26th, the day Guillermo Prieto got back to Tegucigalpa, the Times ran Bonner's first story from Morazan, headlined with Salvador's rebels in combat zone. Guillermo Prieto, who at the time was a stringer for the Post, and for whom scooping the Times was a very big deal, had already been on the telephone with the Post foreign editor, and they managed to get her El Mozote story, along with Massacre's photograph, onto the front page of the first edition. Salvadoran peasants describe mass killing. Woman tells of children's death. Editors in the Times Washington Bureau, seeing the piece in the Post's early edition, telephoned New York, where Bonner's El Mozote story had been awaiting editing at the foreign desk. Craig Whitney, the deputy foreign editor, and the deskman managed to rush Bonner's slightly shorter article headlined Massacre of Hundreds Reported in Salvador Village into the paper's late edition 6 weeks after the massacre. El Mozote had made it onto the front pages of America's two most important newspapers. The following day, Ronald Reagan sent to Congress the administration's certification that the government of El Salvador was making a concerted and significant effort to comply with internationally recognized human rights. But we'll go ahead and end that episode here, just make it a short one. Yeah. Their government was really recognizing human rights. I'm sure. It's ridiculous. Reagan, he may have been a good person as a person, but as a president, he was crap. He was a monster. His mind was so back in the Cold War mentality that he justified these kinds of massacres by saying, we're doing what we need to do. No. No, you're not. Not to mention all the other scandals. Iran-Contra. That was a huge one. It ties in to this a bit. And he really opened the door to the age of Wall Street, of big money. After America had been growing so much and getting so much better after World War II, we had growth, we were getting stronger. Yes, there was the Cold War. It was something we should not have used as, oh, we've got to fight the commies. No. But on an economic level, average Americans were getting a better life. On the whole, there were still issues. Don't sit there and think it was a golden era. It was not. There were still some severe issues. Remember, this is also the era of the fight for civil rights. Brown v. the Board of Education. It was still the attempt to take down Jim Crow. You would have Dr. King, and then later you'd have others, such as Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael. So yeah, there was still some serious issues along the racial lines. But, on the whole, life for the average American was getting better. You were able to afford more, do more. And then at the end of the 70s, you know, the neoliberal idea of we've got to deregulate. It'll only make things better. Yeah. And we're basically back in a second Gilded Age today. And Reagan was a huge part of that. Hell, there's a bigger inequality gap monetarily than there was during the original Gilded Age. We're hitting that point. And none of the presidents over the last 45 years have done anything to go, well, maybe we need to go back to the safety nets to protect Americans. But no. Let's deregulate. That's what's better. Anyway, I didn't mean to get into a rant over economic policies and political issues, but yeah. Reporters sent the stories out and the massacre becomes known. I'm sorry I had problems reading that. Like I said, I'm supposed to get cataract surgery eventually, so my eyes do not focus very well. I had to kind of like move my glasses down so I could use the bifocals that are the kind of hidden bifocals in them to read a bit. But yeah. But that's it for this episode. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.